right? If you don't have the right nutrients or the right amounts thereof, then you'll have a hard time producing antibodies toward these infections. You'll have a hard time defending yourself from an immunological perspective. And so that's pretty much where we start is diving into that conversation around their daily nutrition, figuring out, what are you eating on a day-to-day basis, and where are we getting those nutrients from, and how healthy are those food options specifically.
On today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast, we're going to talk about foundational nutrition in complex chronic disease and environmental medicine and illness. And today's very special guest is Dr. Michael Lehman, a licensed naturopathic physician at Evergreen Naturopathic in his hometown, Spokane, Washington. He specializes in chronic inflammatory conditions and digestive concerns, helping optimize compromised immunity and mitigating, multi-systemic symptoms that we often see associated with these conditions like fatigue and brain fog, anxiety, depression, muscle and joint pain, etc. Dr. Lehman also works a lot with Lyme disease and chronic infections such as mold. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lehman.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben. Really appreciate it.
It's really great. And I'm excited about this topic. So in terms of, foundational nutrition, I mean, we talk a lot about macros and micros and, looking at the vitamins and the minerals that make up the micros and what amount we need optimally, looking at the research. In your practice, how do you approach this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So as a naturopathic physician, obviously the foundations of some of what we do is very nutritionally focused, right? And so a lot of what I do initially with the new patients or otherwise is look into some of those basic labs of, what is your protein content? What is your micronutrients? Things of that nature that are so vital to the process of how is your immune system functioning, right? If you don't have the right nutrients or the right amounts thereof, then you'll have a hard time producing antibodies toward these infections. You'll have a hard time defending yourself from an immunological perspective. And so that's pretty much where we start is diving into that conversation around their daily nutrition, figuring out, what are you eating on a day-to-day basis, and where are we getting those nutrients from, and how healthy are those food options specifically, right? When we're talking about environmental medicine and such, I often will bring up the idea of pesticides in the produce that we eat, and the different options that we have there available to us to differentiate between some of these sources. So.
Yeah, it's amazing how often like the white blood cells and different immune markers are low, and it's literally connected to the fact that the patient's not eating enough protein and they don't realize it.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so a lot of it has to do with, how your gut health is functioning. And if you are, you may be eating all the protein in the world, but are you actually absorbing it? Are you getting it in a form that your unique physiology actually anticipates it being in and can work with that form and function, so to speak? So really diving into what kinds of foods are you actually eating, and the health of those animals, if you're eating animal proteins, or the health of the produce that you're getting from your local farmer's market or what have you. Always a great recommendation for sure. But yeah, I mean, that's the day-to-day process of trying to figure out what is on your plate and how is that being fostered in your own system.
Well, obviously there's a million different diets and a million different people. We follow the doctrine of individuality in naturopathic medicine. We treat everybody individually and customize their plans according to their own epigenetics and their background, et cetera. How do you kind of dive into it? Like what are you looking for, when you assess a diet, and then also in terms of routine labs?
Yeah, so routine labs, I mean, we're looking at your CBC, checking for any nutrient deficiencies that are easily identifiable there, right? If there's some iron deficiency associated with your red blood cell health, or if there's zinc or copper deficiencies associated with some of your white blood cell health, right? Or B vitamin deficiencies associated, or either deficiencies or overabundances of certain nutrients that are in that CBC. You can find so much information there. Your comprehensive metabolic panel is a great tool for identifying if there are any protein or electrolyte imbalances that are associated with your ongoing, fatigue picture or health concerns. So it's a great reference to be able to utilize those key but standard tests that don't cost a lot of money, oftentimes get covered by insurance, things of that nature. So utilizing those tools for the forefront. In the process there, I then dive into kind of asking about the patient's potential for food sensitivities, or are there any particular food cravings that you have? Listening to your body and how it's trying to call out for certain nutrients, or foods that just simply aggravate your digestive system due to how your unique physiology is functioning digestively. And so that's one of the fun parts about my job, is trying to figure out that individual process there with each of my patients that come in.
Yeah, it's amazing how much information we can get from the routine labs. I find it remarkable, and the patients are often so excited because they're like, "Wow, nobody's ever explained this to me like this." I mean, one of my favorite is just like alk phos, which is a protein made by the liver, and it's a zinc-dependent enzyme. And there's sometimes a correlation where the patient may not be absorbing zinc as well, or they're using up their zinc in the metallothioneins and in the kind of the detoxification in their body, because they've got some chronic infection or a high body burden in the background that's using up their zinc, and then it
Right.
shows up in the blood potentially.
Yeah, yeah. So I definitely see it across the board with patients, everything from Lyme disease to Epstein-Barr virus or other herpes viruses. Essentially, in a lot of chronic infections or colonizations of mold or otherwise, there's this nutrient depletion that's taking place with these organisms that are essentially stealing your nutrients. So you could be doing a great job of eating all the vibrant fruits and vegetables and the wonderfully colored foods that are on our plate, but if those nutrients are getting stolen after they've been absorbed, then you've got other problems there on hand. So yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting how in mold illness, we know that the mycotoxins kind of interfere with heme synthesis. And I'm sure you see this all the time where there's often low ferritin and low iron in mold illness. And there's not a lot of studies that kind of show the exact mechanism, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be like, well, if this process isn't happening as well that requires heme and iron, then perhaps it'll show up elsewhere over here, with an infection.
right, exactly. So I mean, that's one of the big takeaways that I learned early on in my practice after graduation, is that a lot of these infections, they actually really thrive in iron-rich environments or environments that are nutrient dense, right? And so you have to be selective sometimes about what form of iron you're taking in or the route of administration. Some people will respond exceptionally well symptomatically to IV iron versus oral iron supplementation, or the difference between oral supplementation with iron and actual iron-rich foods, to make sure that they're actually getting those nutrients in a way that their body can absorb it well, utilize it once it gets taken in, and then sequester it or hold on to it, and instead of allowing that for those infectious agents to steal those nutrients from you.
How did you find yourself working with chronic infection in Lyme? Was it just sort of appeared in Spokane, or were you drawn to it, or do you have some personal experience?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So personally, I have not suffered from Lyme or chronic infections much myself. However, my wife actually, while I was in medical school, we were battling all of these mystery illnesses throughout medical school and trying to figure out, okay, what is actually going on there for her. And it took the majority of medical school to try and figure out exactly what was happening there for her, going from specialist to specialist. And then I already knew that I kind of wanted to get into the immune space in a general sense. But her experience and our experience as a couple really drove me toward more chronic infections, mold and Lyme, and the complexity of all of that. The wrestling with those chronic infections and such from a personal level inside our household really made it clear to me that that was the path forward for me as a practice, and really focusing on the care of both the patients that are suffering and wrestling with these infections, but also their support structures, their family members that are taking care of them. So I do see a lot of patients in that spectrum as far as like primary care, for making sure that your support structures are top notch, to be able to take care of you from the day to day.
In terms of foundational nutrition, it's interesting how we talk about the essentials and the macros and the micros, and then not a lot of people talk about the non-essentials, so-called non-essentials. We know that they are essential, but the dietary fiber, the polyphenols, the antioxidants like glutathione, and it's amazing how in cases these are oftentimes critical and absolutely essential to the case. And the patient may be super depleted or not have any coming in, from their diet. What are some things you look for when you're assessing that?
Yeah, so some of the things that I'm looking for in assessing a person's availability of some of these key nutrients and such is looking at more specialized testing sometimes is required to dive into that. So whether it's an organic acid test to look for some of those key micronutrients that are showing up as depleted, oftentimes we'll see that glutathione deficiency in that spectrum of testing there as well. Checking for, and you mentioned fiber and polyphenols and such, so I oftentimes will run certain comprehensive stool analyses to see like what is the short chain fatty acid composition that's coming out of the microbiome process, right? And are they being fed appropriate prebiotic fibers and those nutrients that they need to thrive and create better immune complexity for ourselves as well. So oftentimes we'll look at the specifically butyrate and other models there to really support what the postbiotic spectrum is, and making sure that we have the key nutrients that we need as their host, so to speak, to really thrive in that environment after taking that situation in. So fiber is critical for that process. Making sure that you are feeding it with good quality amino acids that are both essential and non-essential amino acids, so to speak. But making sure that we have those key nutrients and building blocks for our tissues to repair, which is oftentimes an issue for patients that are facing chronic fatigue issues and these chronic debility of a lot of these complex infectious or autoinflammatory processes that are going on. Yeah, so oftentimes we try to be as simple as possible in our recommendations. Sometimes the best medicine is the easiest medicine for a patient to continue with and sustain. So things like bone broth, if you can tolerate it, are a great tool to get in all of those collagen and peptides and key nutrients from the bone marrow and from the bone material itself, along with a good helping of protein, right? And so that can be a great tool to just sip on through the day, especially this time of year, to kind of warm the body up from the inside out with these vital nutrients in a very easily encapsulated package, so to speak.
When it comes to protein, I mean, I know there's so many different theories, right? And I think that one number we hear is like about 0.36, grams per pound in a person's body weight, which comes out to about a third or, 40% or so. So if a person weighs a couple hundred pounds, they should have at least 80 grams of protein a day. And we hear so
Yeah.
many different things. How do you approach that with different types?
Yeah. So what I typically recommend is there's actually a lot of research that's building around increasing amounts of protein and the idea that some of those metrics and such may have been coming from a very depleted historical state in our society. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, right? But realizing that the human body tends to function better on higher amounts of protein in the context of what it needs. And so oftentimes what I'll do and recommend a slightly higher version of that metric there. So oftentimes we'll be looking at potentially even as high as zero point 0.8 grams of protein for every pound of body weight, or depending on their activity levels, of course, to make sure that you're not only maintaining the tissue that you have, but also actually being available to build those muscle tissues that are so critical for metabolic activity in a general sense. And the more metabolic activity that you have, the more energy your cells are going to be able to produce on a tissue to tissue basis. But we oftentimes will use that kind of a metric there. But it really comes down to how much can a patient tolerate, how much digestive capacity do they have, right? It takes a lot of digestive energy and cellular thermal energy to actually digest those proteins that are so complex. So we definitely have to meet the patient where they are and kind of build them up from the ground up, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm sure you probably have this as well, but I see this often in my practice where I've got a patient with 2 or 3 chronic infections, and they've got really low white blood counts and low red blood counts and other white blood cells, and they're maybe vegetarian or vegan or more plant-based,
Sure.
and we've been working together for months or a year, and it's just hard to kind of get those numbers up. As much as we customize their diet. I have a lot of vegan and plant-based patients. I do eat meat myself, but
Sure.
how do you approach that? Because I know it can be so tricky at times to get those nutrients up without actually consuming animal products temporarily.
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely depends on the patient, right? And so a lot of times, what we're looking at there is making sure that we're really honing in on the digestive health and prowess of our patients, right? And so if their stomach acid isn't up to snuff, so to speak, then adding in the supports of either digestive bitters or apple cider vinegar or something to add to the hydrochloric acid consistency of the digestive tract to really kind of prime that pump so that you're able to digest more thoroughly. So even though the foods that you may be consuming may be lighter protein per se, you're actually absorbing more of those nutrients. Oftentimes with patients of mine, you just can't either tolerate larger portions, like you're not going to sit there and eat a 12, 14 ounce steak or whatnot, or in the plant-based spectrum, you're not going to eat that much tofu or otherwise, all in one sitting. So being able to maximize the nutrient density of those smaller plate sizes, so to speak, in a lot of cases. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's a touchy subject around the sources of some of these food options, right? And depending on the reason that my patient is choosing one format of diet versus another, oftentimes comes into the equation. So is it the care of the animals that's the issue for them? And if we talk about regeneratively raised food sources, is that a difference in their mind, or is it, oh, I've eaten those particular foods and they just don't settle well in my digestive system? And that's another story for sure. But really trying to be able to focus on supporting the body's ability to digest those foods as maximally as possible, so that you're not wasting so much energy on digesting the indigestible, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Lehman, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so I'm over at Evergreen Naturopathic, like you said. So evergreennaturopathic.com is a great place to find me, or I am on Instagram as Dr. Michael Lehman. I'd love to meet with you and chat with you about all of these subjects.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. That concludes today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. We'd love to hear from you, and we value your feedback. If you have any questions or suggestions, please reach out to me at ben@modernvital.com and leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. Also, we look forward to having you join us next week for another exciting episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Modern Vital Podcast. Your support fuels our mission to empower you on your quest for optimal health. Remember, our Modern Vital store offers supplements to guide you on your path to wellness. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share our podcast. Until next time, stay proactive on your health and wellness journey.